Hi Guy, welcome to the AMIGArama podcast. I'm your host Lorfarius and this is our 33rd episode, and for this week we're going to be taking a look at Rick Dangerous. But as always, I thought we'd jump into a bit of news just to get everybody in the mood for the episode. First up, something of interest I noticed over on Everything Amiga recently, that's everythingamiga.com. They've just done a huge spread on the Munsters TV show and the Amiga game and how it all ties together and the licensing and the history, and it's pretty in-depth. It's probably about 10 to 15 minutes reading, maybe if you take your time, but it's quite a lengthy article and it really impressed me the amount of detail that they've gone into, and this is done by a guy called Dreamcatcher. If you listen to the Amigos podcast, you're probably quite familiar to him, but yeah, I'll post a link into the show notes. It really impressed me just how in-depth this guy has gone into the details of this, and I just wish there was more of these people dotted around, because I could do with help like that, guys. If somebody wants to start writing these huge historical articles for me, drop me a line. I'll see what we can do. It might even be interesting. I am always trying to find out different bits of Amiga news, but it's not always possible. I mean, you know, it is a pretty old system and it's always limited to what I can find at the time. But one thing I do try and keep an eye on is any sort of like Commodore news, because it all ties into the Amiga and stuff and the history of the company and things. But something really did catch me interest about a week ago. I was looking at sceneworld.org and they released a podcast recently where they did like a full interview with Robert Bernado, and I'll just read out the blurb from their site. Robert Bernado is a very known figure in the American Commodore scene. Being the head of the Fresno Commodore user group, we've been in touch with him since we started with SceneWorld 18 years ago. Time to talk to him and hear about his side of our Commodore user world and sphere. Enjoy listening to his experience. I'll put a link into the show notes as usual, but it really was interesting. I mean, this guy's been involved in Commodore and all the systems, and this is mainly based around like the C64 and stuff, but if you're into Commodore history in any way, this is a pretty good site to look at. And yeah, I'm shouting up another podcast, but we're all out there doing the same thing, so it's great to know that there's other shows out and about there. Of course, if you'd like to, this is a dodgy link, but if you'd like to support the show, by all means come to our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/AMIGArama, or pop on over to the Twitter account @AMIGAramaPod, or even the Facebook page, facebook.com/AMIGArama. Oh God, there's a lot of them. Or the main site, AMIGArama.com. I should just get these written down on a script and can't start coming out with them. But as always, I want to send out a huge thank you to our Patreon supporters. It's always great that they've stuck with me for so long. I really am grateful for everything that's been passed on to me. Also then people who've supported the podcast by sticking interviews up on the iTunes account. Again, that's the main way that podcast gets seen and getting charts and things and pulling new viewers. And I'm always, aware that I need to bring more people into this, and the Amiga community is probably quite small, but I'm sure with people's help, even if you share it or just pass the details on, we'll get word out there that AMIGArama actually exists. With that out of the way, let's take a look at this week's game. Now, for this week, I've gone and picked Rick Dangerous. Now, this isn't something I was familiar with back when I was a kid. But, try to find games to cover each week. I'm always trying to find something that's really interesting or got some sort of like peculiar reputation. And this seems like a really, really popular title that a lot of people have got very fun but frustrating memories of, which I'm sure you'll understand when we get a bit further into the review. It was published by Firebird. Now, they were responsible for some pretty big games like Bubble Bobble, Elite, The Sentinel. There was a huge list of them, but back in the late 80s and early 90s, they were pretty prolific with the amount of games that they released. The developer for this was Core. Now, I'm sure you all know who they are. From the Amiga, they did things like Chuck Rock, Jaguar XJ220, and then later on the Tomb Raider series. They pretty much tell you who they are themselves. So it was on one disc, and it was released in 1989. Now, the coder behind the game was a chap called Simon Phipps. Now, he was involved in some pretty big Amiga games, I think. The Switchblade series, in particular the first one. He was also a developer over on the ZX Spectrum. But he also did Monty Python's Flying Circus, Dragonstone, which I think is it's a top-down RPG. And is that on the CD32? Again, I've written it down, but I've not actually taken note of that. The graphics, Simon was involved in those as well. He was also on a team with Terry Lloyd, and Terry was involved in games like Action Fighter, which I think that was a conversion of the arcade game. Fantasy World Dizzy on the Amiga. Now, that was one of my all-time favourite ZX Spectrum games, so it's good to see that it did eventually come to the Amiga. I'm going to have a look that one up, actually. I mean, like I say, I love the Spectrum because it was so simplistic, but such a big world. So I wonder how it actually turned out in an Amiga version. Oh, and something else of interest, Skids, which is a proper 80s name, I think, there. Yeah, very, very peculiar. The music for the game was done by Ben Daglish. Daglish. I may have said that wrong. I'm really sorry, Ben, if you ever catch up to this. He did in music for Chubby Gristle. I think that was a game. I seem to remember that on the ZX Spectrum. So that must have been a port, but it was about a traffic warden that would go bouncing around the levels, a bit like the old Monty Mole games as well on the Spectrum. Flintstones. I think that was a platformer. Pac-Mania. Oh, that's quite an interesting one. That was like a 3D styled game at the time. Oh, and Supercars. He's loads and loads of music. It'd probably take me 10 hours to go through all of them. David Pridmore also was involved with the music. He also did Monty Python's Flying Circus, Corporation. Oh, the sequel to this, Rick Dangerous 2. Yes, there was one. And something called Saint and Grievesy. Was that an old television show back on the BBC? I'm not sure. Some of them, this did surprise me actually. Simon Phipps also did some of the music. This guy pretty much did the lot, and Terry Lloyd as well. But I'm not sure what music they did. But again, we'll get to that later. It was released across all sort of computers, Acorn Archimedes, Commodore 64, Atari ST, ZX Spectrum, Amstrad CPC, a DOS version, later re-released on the iTunes App Store, I believe. So it's pretty prolific, the amount of releases that this came out on. Now, one of the things I always do is go through the original box, whether that's just scans or pictures and stuff, and it actually turns out that this came with a story comic by a chap called Ian Gibson, and he's quite famous for the 2000 AD's Robo Hunter comic. I'm not a big comic person, I'm afraid, but I believe he's quite famous. I think Dave Gibson is my knowledge of Amiga comic book artists at the time, I think, and because he did Beneath a Steel Sky, the comic that came with that. But again, I've seen something like that. I did have a read through some of the scans, and it was your very noir style, but over the top action adventure thing. I mean, they're all sat around dinner with Rick, he's the hero and stuff, and he's charming a young lady when all of a sudden a waiter comes up with a tray and there's a ticking sound, and when he pulls the tray up, it's like, oh my god, there's a bomb, and it's just crazy as that sounds. Now, I was also able to find a few interviews with Simon Phipps. He seems to be quite open to asking questions about this, but I couldn't find any contact details, I'm afraid, so you'll have to put up with what I was able to find out. But one of the interesting things I did discover, that the entire concept for the game, and pretty much all the design and the ideas were done on just 3 pieces of A3 paper, and he scanned these and put them online. They look absolutely fantastic. But he did like original artwork artwork and proper versions of Rick and the baddies and some of the level design and stuff and bits of text written on, and it's really interesting to see as designed because it gives you an idea of the sort of things they would do back in the day to pitch games, because like Core now, like, is a huge company, but back then, they just come up with an Amiga game and write it in several months' time. So to see that process available like that, because I mean, this is a lot of hidden history we just don't get to see these days, so it's great that it was online. Originally, there was a ZX Spectrum game called Joe Blade, and from what I can see in interview, Simon basically said that he designed a lot of the characters off the back of that, and there was a very squash look to them on the screen, and he pretty much brought it over. One of the things that I did notice that across all the different versions of the game is the entire screen is 256 pixels across, and they kept that pretty much straight across all the versions. There is no difference. But what I could tell from looking at what he was saying, it was actually down to time constraints. They did an original design, then just started porting like crazy. But it does mean there's not really any difference between the versions, except for say like colours and maybe a bit more complex graphics on things like the ST and the Amiga. But if you go back to any of them, they're pretty much all the same. They play the same. There is a bit of voice included in the game, and it's only a little scream, and it's usually when people die. But that's actually the programmer, Simon Phipps. He really does have his fingers over everything in this game. He was able to get the entire game done from original development right through to the end to release in just 4 months, which is quite impressive. There's a total of 135 screens across the entire game, and he pretty much designed all of them. From what I could tell, even though it did have a sequel, he did want to do a third game like years and years later, but he was unable to discover who actually had the rights. I mean, it's your typical thing from back in the 90s. There's so many like software houses and publishers involved, and they're all buying each other out year after year after year. That things just disappear, and this is the time before computers were properly a thing, and probably all this paperwork stuffed in a filing cabinet somewhere. But it's a bit of a shame, really, because there is a lot that you could go to, in this style of game, because it's just a platformer, but it's an interesting platformer. Again, I'll hope, as I can explain as we get into it more. Now, some fans of the original did recreate it for the OS 4.1. I think that was released back in 2017. It's quite readily available online. There's a few downloads going there. I'm not entirely sure of the legality of that, so I don't think I can post the link in the show notes. But just know, if you tap in Amiga OS 4.1, if you're running it, you'll be able to play it. Another thing you realise when you get this out of the box, which really struck me, was the entire manual for the game is really short. There's not much to it. It's on the back of, it's like a movie poster. There's like a live actor there, stood there with the gun and stuff. Oh, sorry, he's in the forest. I'm thinking of the actual main cover. And there's like a spear stuck in a tree beside of him. And then some of the actual designs from the original design documents that I mentioned before is actually included there. So nothing was wasted. And as I saw it, and I just kept thinking, this really reminds me of those 8-bit cassette tapes, where you basically open it up and you might fold it out slightly and there's just a couple of pages and everything's crammed in there, from loading instructions to how to play the game, little bits and bobs. And it's really fascinating to think, this is a big on full Amiga release, and it's such a tiny bit of info being given to you. It just struck me as interesting. With it just being a poster for the actual game manual, there's really not much there for it, and I had to really dig to find out what the full story was. But when you actually open the game up, you get a little bit of text there, and it's like a little movie picture frame that's playing, and with a little plane crashing in the background. And this is what it says. Rick Dangerous crash lands his plane over the Amazon while searching for the lost Gulu tribe. But by a terrible twist of fate, he lands in the middle of a bunch of wild Gulus. Can Rick escape these angry Amazonian antagonists? ? And that's it. That's pretty much the entire explanation for the game. It's nice and simple. It's straight to the point. Now, the game itself is a 2D platformer. It's very similar to Switchblade and Switchblade 2. Very small, squished, I would say like chunky graphics. I do keep saying chunky quite a lot in these podcasts, but a lot of the time it fits these sort of style of games. Very reminiscent of the Magic Pockets type, the Chaos Engine type with the graphics. It makes the characters look fat, like they've had like a mallet dropped on top of them. It's a very different look. I'm not quite sure how to describe it well. Now, when you first fire up the game, it's nice and simple. Top of the screen, you've got information bar. You've got things up there like the score, bullets, dynamite, and lives. You start with 6 of each. But one of the greatest things about this is when you first start is there is a boulder rolling behind you. You have to move, and you have to move quickly. You are darting from left to right, from screen to screen. Very, very similar to Indiana Jones and like the Raiders of the Lost Ark movie. There are a lot of things in this which I think are pretty much stolen from Indy, but I suppose that shouldn't surprise you in a way, because this is core design, and they were quite guilty, I think, in a way of pinching a lot of ideas from that to do the whole Tomb Raider series. I don't know why core focused on that one so much. Rick himself he's even wearing the same colour fedora as Indiana Jones. It's very, very peculiar. He's got that leather jacket and everything. The looks down there. When you look at the game cover, it's a live actor holding a gun with his arm up to the side. It's pinched off the indie films, and it's quite a very dodgy way of doing it, but it doesn't like it. It's not like Rindy Jones or anything like that. They do get away with it, of course, with and there's such a lot of action tropes, I suppose, in the Indiana Jones films, because they were that sort of, all based on those old serial films and the weekly adventures and stuff. So it's not pinching too much, but it's just quite funny the way they've gone about it. The levels themselves, they all have a very, very similar look. Like nice big chunky colours. It's quite well drawn, and the environment you're in is quite convincing, and it works really, really well. Now, one of the things that did surprise me for this, and it's even considering it's a single disc game, that there are only 4 levels. It's based across an Aztec temple, Egyptian temple, so it'd probably be inside a pyramid, but you don't see the outside. It was like a German castle. Again, this is all the Indiana Jones stuff, and a nuclear bunker as well. But I don't think there was really anything nuclear in the indie film. Oh, what am I saying? There's no fridges in this, I'm quite happy to say, but that was a much later film. But it's very, very... you can easily tell where it got its influences from. There's 74 different enemies and trap types across the whole of the game. The enemies are your typical human guys. You've got like the Amazonian, the Gulus, I don't know what else to call them, Nazis thrown in there, some dogs and animals, soldiers. It's very much fitting to the era that it's in. There's nothing that really stands out there, and there's certainly no boss types or anything like that. I said the game itself doesn't really have much of a story beyond the introduction, but as you go from level to level, it does do a little bit of a couple of paragraphs of jokey text, and it's just a little bit of humour thrown in there, I think, just to give you a reason for it. But in a way, it's very much like that old serial style story. It gives you something to do every time. There's nothing really that you're aiming towards. It's more of an adventure series on one disc, I suppose. Now, of course, Rick has just a couple of weapons, like the dynamite, the bullets, things like that. You can collect extra as you're exploring the levels and working your way through. One thing about it is completely a single hit kill, so if anything touches you in any way, shape or form, you will die. But one of the really good things in a way, I suppose, about this is really, really difficult. You will die again. Even me, just like when I was first trying to play this, I must have spent a good 40 minutes just trying to get through the first level. It is absolutely lethal. The main drive about every level is you have to pretty much memorize the way to get through. It's quite limited in there's not like multiple paths to go around, and you're just bouncing your way around different traps and things that are going on in single rooms. But you have to use a lot of trial and error. You have to take your time to explore, shooting up and down ladders, moving around, avoiding the enemies, killing them at the right time. Sometimes it's an idea to save your weapons and just like jump over them, but you have to be a bit careful with the collision detection because it's not 100%, but it's enough that you can explore most areas and jump over the enemies and get out of most sticky situations. But the biggest thing about it, especially with the number of lives that you start with, is you're just going to die constantly, and I think that's just a big part of how the game actually plays. One of the greatest things I did notice about this is the enemies are on a path, or they will stay to an area. So like say there's a big long straight in front of them, they will be walking left and right, and simple stuff like pretty much every other platformer, I suppose. But if you get within like seeing distance of them, they will head over towards you, and it just makes them a little bit more interesting. They just seem to have a little bit of AI almost, that little bit of intelligence. They will respond to you being in the area, and it just means that they're not constantly sticking 100% to that path. If you drop in front of them, they will go for you straight away. So you've got to think on your toes and react to things differently. And of course, with the main push about this, you are going to die constantly all the time because it is, it can be quite difficult. There's a lot of traps in there. Well, I said the boulder's probably the easiest. There's things like cages set up, switches to push to open doors and things, and you've got to really time jumps to get through. It's really simple. Didn't say the controls did I before. It's really simple to bounce around. You have to like use a direction and say fire to use like the bullet. Or the dynamite and stuff, and you just bounce over the head with the jump. Nice and simple. There's nothing complicated. There's not like multiple key presses to choose between different weapons and stuff. They really, really keep this to the core basics. God, core basics, that was not a pun. I just said that off the top of my own head. There is no game music at all, except like on the title screen and in between the levels. And it's usually something like a bit of classical music. I think it sounded like classical music to me, or maybe it was original. But that was a bit disappointing in a way, they're not having actually during the game. But the sound effects for this are absolutely fantastic. The weapons make all the right noises. There's things like explosions. Even though it's only Simon Phipps, there's that voice in there. The guns fire in a very satisfying way. The arrows do that weird whip noise when they fly across and hit something. Like I say, the explosions, it really, really works well for the environment. It's sad that there's no music there, but there's enough going on, and the difficulty is such that you don't really pay attention to it. And I do wonder if they removed the music, because it'd be probably too much to be focusing on something different at a time, I suppose. At times you want things to be quiet. Then again, people could always use a mute button, couldn't they? Of course, this wouldn't be a 2D platformer without lots of secrets and things to find and explore. There's loads dotted throughout the game. It can be quite tough to find them. And some of them are dotted like through hidden doorways, and you have to find like switches, whatever, to open them. Or you can wander through walls in just the right spot to get a few extras and things like that. But it's not the push of the game. You will spend most of your time exploring the levels, learning the levels, getting the timing down and responding to things and the enemies and the traps. So the secrets are there more of I think to me it felt like more of a bonus for when you've actually completed the game. And no, by the way, I did not finish it. I did try my best, but I couldn't get very far at all. To some degree, this just does feel more like a puzzle game than just some like typical platformer. The difficulty is really, really high. One of the things you really need for a game like this, I'm sorry, these are the problems with it, I suppose, but the controls are not 100%. Most of the time they work well enough, but there's a few times where I wasn't sure if it was the collision detection, it was just the way I was responding to use it with the joystick, and I tried it with the controller as well. It just wasn't all the way there, and it can be a bit fiddly to do the actions and the weapons at the same time when you try to move dead quickly through a section, and it can be counterintuitive, but that's just me. Sometimes I think you might play it a bit differently. You might be much faster to respond and deal with things. I mean, it's a lot of memorization, so it pushes you down that path anyway. The problem is it's very easy to die, and you will get frustrated with it, and when there's a delay, or I thought there was a delay with the controls, it can be a lot of frustrating moments. I mean, the difficulty itself is a fair problem, especially for the size of the game, and it sort of makes sense because there's only 4 levels, but it really is off the charts. You have to take your time. You have to sit there and focus and concentrate and watch how things respond to you in the room. The way the scrolling works, it's a single screen game, but when you get to the edge, it will move down slightly. It's not like scrolling and following the character around, so you really have to plan the moves around the area you're in. But I'm quite happy to say there was no like blind jumps or anything like that. You usually move towards the edge, you either flick onto the next screen, or let's say you get to the beginning of some ladders or a drop, it will just drop down a bit as you fall, so you can just see what's ahead. And even though there was frustrating deaths of it with probably things I'd done wrong, there was never a point where it's because of the scroll, and it works just good enough for the type of game it is. At the same time though, because you've got such a high difficulty, I mean this is more of an action adventure puzzle game, I think. But, and I know I said that before with a puzzle type, but it's very, very strange. It's like an indie game, but it goes beyond that. It's like one of these old puzzles and death traps. You've got to constantly be on your toes and working your way around. And I would have preferred the scrolling to move some degree with the character and not be that single screen, that sort of flicking quickly. Because at the same time, I'd just prefer to be able to see much further ahead, or it feels more fluid when you try to bounce from an area and you go from one screen to the other and it flicks over. I mean, I'm half and half about that. It just did frustrate me a bit whilst I was playing, but not enough that I was sat there thinking this is completely terrible. So it's a bit of a funny issue to bring up. One of the greatest parts of this game is the opening section, because as it starts, you're in the path of this huge rolling boulder, and it's only a couple of screens long, and you've got to run quickly, and you're jumping over pits and out of the way, and at the bottom of all this is like a bad guy, and when you get to the end, you run to the right, and the boulder falls on top of him and kills him, and you get to hear that familiar screen, which is fantastic. But there's also some music there that just it really, really kicks in, and it's fast, and it follows you with a boulder. And again, I mentioned music before, but it's just the fact that there should be more moments like that. It really needs to add something extra with the music. And I wish there was like an indie theme, I suppose. That's something I like the James Bond bit. If he does something cool and then it kicks in and reverberates around, and there's just not enough of that, and it really, really is a problem. The other thing, of course, is there's only 4 levels, and I'm sure they're only trying to make a real difficult but short game. At the same time, though, it gets a bit annoying because you just think, even after I've spent umpteen hours getting through this with the difficulty, it'd be great if you could come back, and I've probably think about 7 or 8 levels would have done it. They could have easily doubled them up, I'm sure. I mean, the game itself, it's not some big, huge, complicated, over-the-top top maps and squillions and squillions of screens. I think it was, as I say, 135. It just needed some more. I'm sure they could have fitted either another disc or maybe squeezed some more on there. It was very, very odd why it's just so short. Having said that, for a game which is about instant deaths, learning your way through, memorising everything, it really doesn't have that many problems. It works well enough, even though I had problems with the controls. that might just be down to the way I was playing it. If you're a bit quicker with your reflexes and you can respond and you're used to that sort of thing, you'd probably be fine. In fact, you probably have, it's something like a shooter where you've got lots and lots going on the screen. That's what it reminded me of. You've got to be quick, you've got to be moving, you've got to be on your toes, you've got to be playing. And oh my God, does it make you concentrate, because you really have to focus on the sections as you're working your way through. It's not mental like a shooter, by the way. There's not like loads of things exploding and going off at once, but there's enough in the immediate area around Rick that you really have to work your way through carefully. The magazines were extremely kind to this. CU Amiga gave it 95%. Amiga Format gave it 89 on release, but later on when there was I think it was a Kix re-release, they dropped it to 75. That did happen with a few of the other mags actually, so I don't know if they were all starstruck when it first came out, but the One gave it 88%, so that's not too bad. CVG 87, Amiga Force 70%, oh there's one. Amiga Format, which I thought was actually quite unfair. The review was very, very short, to be honest, but it got 17%. Now, it does have its problems. I think this is a bit of a fan favourite because it's still thought about to this day. I mean, it's not an overly huge game or anything, but I can understand why, because of all the stuff you've got to do. You really have to take your time a bit. People will have a lot of fond memories of that, but there's nothing, absolutely nothing in this game which shouts out to me, this is worth 17%. For me, this is probably a 7 or 8 out of 10. I think the 90%ers there are just a wee bit hard. The biggest problem with the whole thing is the difficulty. I mean, I keep saying you've got to memorize, but I was constantly on like on the tips of my toes and like going and, gripping the stick and taking my time. My God, that does sound dodgy. But you really have to focus and learn the game properly. I'm not usually very good at stuff like this, but the difference is I did have a lot of fun, and with a lot of perseverance, you can get quite far in this. It'll take time and effort, but there's enough going on that it does push you in. The traps dotted throughout the game, there's nothing like it's a proper puzzle. It's like really, really difficult. Most of them are just very simple things like traps, and they take time to get past, and you really have to rush through an area. But the thing is, it's really difficult, and the one-hit kill makes it difficult, and it makes you appreciate what you've got in front of you. You could, if you wanted, complete this without the bullets or using the dynamite. I think there's a few points where you've got to use a dynamite to blow things up, like walls or rocks and things like that, and different points through the levels. But I mean, for the most part, you don't have to use it to kill the enemies. You could time it to do run-throughs, bounce across them. Take your time and be careful. And I suppose it adds that extra level of challenge and something a bit interesting to come back to later. It does feel to me like a bit of a budget game. It's quite small. I don't feel like there's enough levels, but I know I keep saying it. I have never experienced a game as difficult as this. I've never had to focus on anything in God knows how long. Even going back to the 90s, I don't think any of the games I was playing. It's torture in a way. I suppose it reminds me of like the 8-bit games back in the day where like Manic Miner and stuff, you've got to be really pixel perfect jumping. And there are sections in this which are a bit like that, but most of it you can fumble your way through and just about survive. And I really can see why people hold this game in such high regard. I mean, with me, it doesn't get a super high score because I'm a bit of wuss with games like this. They're just not my sort of thing, but there's a lot going on there, and I did have fun whilst I was playing it. It is hard, but it is fun, and you'll probably have you won't spend very long playing it, depending on which way you go, but you could probably complete this in a couple of hours, probably even less if you were trying. I think some of the walkthroughs I glanced at were like super time through in about 25 minutes or something like that. I mean, they're like super players. They're really on the ball and stuff. but it's short, it's sweet, it feels a bit like a budget game. It does have a sequel. I did play that because I was interested to see like maybe there'd be huge and big changes. I think there's only like 4 or 5 levels on that one, and in a way it's a bit cheeky because it feels like it's some sort of a expansion disc to the first one, but it was exactly the same sort of game. I'm not going to do a full episode on that. Oh, maybe I will. It depends what you guys think of this one, but the fact that it's more of the same, so if you get a bit annoyed at say I want to have 4 levels in the first one, you go straight to the sequel and there's not really any difference. It's very similar graphics. Sorry, I'm going into a semi-review of that, but I think it's worth looking up if you enjoy the first one, because you'll just go straight into the second and it's the same sort of thing. And with that, I think we shall call it a day. If you want to see me suck rather badly at this, you can come over to AMIGArama.com and have a look at the YouTube footage on there. I can apologise now for those who haven't watched it yet. Probably just ignore it. Just listen to this and go to the next episode. It's probably the best answer. If you've enjoyed the podcast and you're still with me after all this time, God, I can't believe that we're still rolling on. It's week after week and we can't seem to stop. If you want to offer some support, you can come over to patreon.com/AMIGArama, or even just stop by the Facebook page, which is facebook.com/AMIGArama, and either comment on this or leave a line. I'm, as always, looking for suggestions and ideas for future shows. I want to share this show with you guys. I don't want it to be 100% just me constantly reading through these games on my own with no suggestions from people. I really appreciate when people get involved. Thanks for listening and see you next time.